father and son's portrait from 1800s, hides horrible secret in their hands. Historical investigation. The Library of Congress. Prints and Photographs Division receives donations of historical photographs almost weekly, most arriving with minimal documentation about their origins or subjects. Curators process these images, cataloging them for researchers and preserving them for future generations. But on a January morning in 2024, curator Dr. James Patterson opens a package that will lead to one of the most disturbing discoveries about post-Civil War racial violence in the institution's history. The donation comes from an estate sale in Mobile, Alabama. The letter explains that the items belong to the Thornton family, whose last surviving member passed away at 93, with no children or close relatives. The executor, handling the estate, discovered a collection of photographs and documents in a safe deposit box. Thinking they might have historical value, she sent them to the Library of Congress. James carefully removes a large albumen print from its archival sleeve. The photograph is in remarkable condition, protected for over a century in what must have been climate-controlled storage. A photographer's mark on the mounting board reads, Harrison and Company, Mobile, Alabama, 1873. The image shows a formal portrait, taken against a painted backdrop, depicting misty trees and atmospheric outdoor scenery. The sepia tones give the photograph a somber, dignified quality. 3 figures are arranged in a carefully composed tableau. At the center sits an elderly white man, perhaps in his 70s, seated in an ornate carved wooden chair with decorative spindles and elaborate scrollwork. He wears a dark formal suit with a bow tie, his white hair neatly combed, his expression stern and commanding. His hands are clasped in front of him in a formal gesture, fingers interlaced, thumbs pressed together, forming a distinctive triangular shape. Standing on either side of the seated man are 2 young black boys, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, dressed in identical dark suits with white collars. They stand at rigid attention, their postures mirror images of each other. Most strikingly, their hands are clasped in exactly the same way as the white man's, fingers interlaced, thumbs pressed together, forming the same triangular gesture. The symmetry is perfect, almost eerie. The boys flanking the man like bookends, their identical positioning, their matching hand gestures. Everything suggests this was carefully choreographed, deliberately composed to convey a specific message. James has catalogued thousands of historical photographs, including many from the Reconstruction era, showing complex racial dynamics. But something about this image makes him pause and look more closely. He pulls out his magnifying glass and examines the photograph under his desk lamp. The hand gesture all 3 figures are making. James studies it carefully. The triangular formation created by the interlaced fingers and pressed thumbs is distinctive and deliberate. It's not a natural, comfortable position for hands to rest. This is a posed gesture, something specific and meaningful. James photographs the image at high resolution and begins searching for information about hand gestures and symbols used in the 1870s. He knows that fraternal organizations, secret societies, and various groups used hand signals to identify members. Could this gesture have special significance? He turns the photograph over. The back of the mounting board has an inscription in faded brown ink. Judge Nathaniel Thornton, with Marcus and Samuel. Mobile, Alabama, October 1873. And below that, in different handwriting, much more recent, written in pencil, Grandfather's Apprentices. The gesture was his mark. God forgive what he did to them. James reads the note several times. His mark. The hand gesture wasn't just for the photograph. It was Thornton's mark. something that identified people who belonged to him or were under his control. And whatever he did to Marcus and Samuel required divine forgiveness. James spends the rest of the day researching Judge Nathaniel Thornton. He finds extensive records. Thornton had been a prominent figure in Mobile, serving as a circuit court judge from 1868 to 1882. Before the Civil War, he had owned a large plantation outside Mobile, with over 60 enslaved people. After emancipation, Thornton remained powerful and wealthy. He served on various boards, belonged to elite social clubs, and was described in newspaper articles as a pillar of the community. But James finds hints of something darker in reports about Thornton's court rulings during Reconstruction. From the Mobile Register, 1871, Judge Thornton sentenced 3 Negro youths to terms of apprenticeship for vagrancy. The boys, aged 9 to 12, were found without employment or guardianship and were remanded to the custody of Judge Thornton himself, who will ensure they learn useful trades. James knows about the apprenticeship system that developed after the Civil War. Under black codes passed by Southern states, black children could be forcibly apprenticed to white masters if they were deemed orphans or their parents couldn't support them. In practice, this system functioned as a way to re-enslave black children, forcing them into unpaid labor under conditions barely distinguishable from slavery. He finds more articles about Thornton apprenticing black children. Over a 10-year period, Thornton had placed dozens of black children into apprenticeships, sometimes with other white families, but often with himself. The articles describe this as charitable work, providing vagrant children with homes and education. But James suspects there's more to the story. He contacts Dr. Sarah Williams, a historian at the University of Alabama, who specializes in Reconstruction-era Alabama and the apprenticeship system's use to re-enslave black children. Sarah calls him back within 2 hours. Nathaniel Thornton. I know that name. He ran one of the most extensive child apprenticeship operations in Alabama after the war. Send me what you have, especially that photograph. James emails her the high-resolution images and the inscription. They arrange to meet at the Alabama Department of Archives and History in Montgomery, where Sarah has already requested records related to Thornton's apprenticeship cases. That evening, James can't stop thinking about the photograph. He zooms in on the faces of Marcus and Samuel, studying their expressions. They're children, but there's something in their eyes, a wariness, a guardedness, an absence of childhood innocence that speaks of experiences no child should have. And that hand gesture, all 3 making the same sign, the boys positioned like sentries flanking their master. The more James looks at it, the more it seems less like a portrait and more like a display of ownership, a documentation of control. James meets Sarah at the Alabama Department of Archives and History 3 days later. The archivist has pulled extensive records related to Nathaniel Thornton, court documents, apprenticeship papers, and correspondence. They divide the work. Sarah takes the court records while James examines personal correspondence and newspaper archives. Within an hour, Sarah finds the apprenticeship papers for Marcus and Samuel. Both boys were apprenticed to Thornton in 1869, when they were approximately 6 years old. The documents claim the boys were orphans with no means of support, making them eligible for apprenticeship under Alabama law. But the paperwork raises immediate questions. The boys' last names are listed as unknown. Their parents are listed as deceased or whereabouts unknown. There's no evidence that anyone investigated whether the boys actually had living parents or relatives who could care for them. This was standard practice, Sarah explains grimly. White men would claim black children were orphans, get a judge, often a friend or relative, to approve the apprenticeship, and essentially re-enslave the children. The parents were often alive but powerless to stop it. James finds more disturbing information in Thornton's personal correspondence. In a letter to his brother dated 1870, Thornton writes, "The apprenticeship system has proven most advantageous. I currently have 6 Negro boys in my service, learning carpentry and other useful trades. They cost me nothing in wages, only room and board, and provide excellent labor. They are obedient and hard-working, as I have implemented a system of discipline that ensures compliance. Brother, I encourage you to take advantage of this opportunity while it remains available." Sarah finds the system of discipline described in court documents. In 1872, a social worker from a northern charity visited Thornton's home and filed a complaint about the treatment of apprenticed children. The complaint described boys as young as 6 working from dawn until dark in Judge Thornton's workshop and on his property. They sleep in a shed behind the house with minimal bedding. They are inadequately fed and clothed. Most disturbing is the judge's practice of branding the boys with a distinctive mark, a triangular symbol burned into the palm of their right hand, which he claims is necessary to identify them should they attempt to run away. James and Sarah stare at the document in horror. Thornton had branded the children. The hand gesture in the photograph, fingers interlaced, thumbs pressed together, forming a triangle, was designed to display those brands, to show that the boys bore Thornton's mark burned into their flesh. The photograph isn't just documentation of apprenticeship, James says quietly. It's documentation of ownership. Thornton had the boys pose with their hands positioned to display the brands, proving they belonged to him. They search for what happened after the social worker's complaint and find that it was dismissed. Thornton, as a sitting judge, used his influence to have the investigation dropped. The social worker was accused of northern interference and asked to leave Alabama. Sarah finds testimony from other apprenticed children who eventually aged out of Thornton's control. In 1885, a man named Daniel Johnson testified before a congressional committee investigating conditions for Black Americans in the South. "I was apprenticed to Judge Nathaniel Thornton in 1870 when I was 7 years old. My mother was alive, working as a washerwoman in Mobile. But Judge Thornton claimed I was a vagrant orphan and had me remanded to his custody. For 8 years, I worked for Judge Thornton without wages. We worked in his carpentry shop from sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week. We were given minimal food, usually cornmeal and occasionally scraps of meat. We slept in a shed with no heat in winter. When I was 8 years old, Judge Thornton had me and the other boys branded. He heated an iron in his forge and pressed it into our palms, burning a triangular mark into the flesh. He said this mark showed we were his property, that if we ran away, anyone who saw the mark would know to return us to him. The pain was unbearable. The healing took weeks, and the scar remains to this day. I carry Judge Thornton's mark on my hand, a permanent reminder of the years I spent in bondage after slavery was supposed to have ended. In 1873, Judge Thornton had a photograph made with me and another boy named Marcus. He positioned us on either side of him and made us clasp our hands in a specific way that displayed the brands he had burned into our palms. He wanted documentation of his ownership, proof that we bore his mark. After that photograph, I never saw Marcus again. Judge Thornton told us that Marcus had been sent to work for another man. but boys sometimes disappeared from the apprenticeship, and we never knew what happened to them. Some said they died from overwork or punishment, others that they were sold to plantation owners who needed laborers. I was released from apprenticeship in 1878 when I turned 15. By law, apprenticeships ended at 15 for boys, 18 for girls. But by then, I had no education, no family connections, no resources. I had spent 8 years in forced labor, branded like livestock, and I was released into a world where I had no means of survival. Judge Thornton faced no consequences for what he did to me and dozens of other children. He was respected, powerful, protected by law and custom. The apprenticeship system was legal. The branding was called discipline. And we were black children, so our testimony counted for nothing against a white judge's reputation. James sits back from the document, overwhelmed. The photograph shows Daniel Johnson. He must be the Samuel mentioned in the inscription, or perhaps there were even more boys than just Marcus and Samuel. The testimony makes clear that Thornton systematically branded apprenticed children and displayed those brands in the photograph. We need to find out what happened to Marcus and Samuel specifically, Sarah says, and we need to find descendants of the children Thornton apprenticed, if any survived and had families. They search through records after 1873, looking for any mention of Marcus or Samuel in connection with Thornton. For Marcus, they find nothing, no records after 1873, as if he vanished completely. But for Samuel, they find a death certificate dated 1874, just 1 year after the photograph. Samuel, last name unknown. Date of death, March 15th, 1874. Age, approximately 12. Cause of death, injuries from fall. Additional notes, apprentice of Judge N. Thornton. Fell from roof while working. Death, ruled accidental. Injuries from fall, Sarah says skeptically. That's what they claimed when children died during forced labor. Always accidents, never acknowledging the conditions that led to their deaths. James searches newspaper archives and finds a brief mention of Samuel's death in the Mobile Register. A Negro boy apprenticed to Judge Thornton died Tuesday from injuries sustained in a fall. Judge Thornton stated the boy was working on repairs to his home when he lost his footing and fell from the roof. The death has been ruled accidental, and Judge Thornton expressed regret at the loss of the boy's labor. The casual reference to losing the boy's labor, rather than mourning the child's death, is chilling. Samuel was property to be replaced, not a human being to be grieved. They trace what happened to Daniel Johnson after his 1885 congressional testimony and find that he moved north to Philadelphia, where he worked as a carpenter, the trade Thornton had forced him to learn, and eventually married and had children. His descendants are still in the Philadelphia area. Sarah contacts genealogists who specialize in tracing black families through Reconstruction and locate Daniel Johnson's great-great-granddaughter, Reverend Patricia Johnson, a minister in Philadelphia who has been researching her family history. James calls Reverend Johnson, his heart heavy with what he has to share. Reverend Johnson, my name is Dr. James Patterson from the Library of Congress. I've been researching your great-great-grandfather, Daniel Johnson, and I've discovered some disturbing information about his childhood apprenticeship to a judge in Alabama who branded him and other children. Patricia Johnson's response is immediate. The brand. I know about it. My grandmother showed me Daniel's hand when I was young. He had a triangular scar on his palm. She said it was a mark from slavery times, from a white man who owned him after slavery was supposed to be over. She said there was a photograph somewhere showing Daniel and another boy with the man who marked them, but we never had a copy. "I have that photograph," James says carefully. "And I have Daniel's congressional testimony describing exactly what was done to him. I also have court records and correspondence documenting how Judge Thornton systematically apprenticed black children, branded them, and forced them to work without wages under conditions barely different from slavery." Patricia Johnson travels to Washington 2 days later. James and Sarah meet her at the Library of Congress, and they spend the afternoon sharing everything they've discovered. Patricia examines each document with the careful attention of both a minister and a descendant, learning the full truth about her ancestors' suffering. When she sees the photograph, her great-great-grandfather as a child, standing rigid beside the white man who branded him, his hands positioned to display that brand, she weeps openly. "We always knew Daniel survived terrible things," she says when she can speak. "We knew he was forced to work as a child, that he carried that scar his whole life, that he never spoke about his childhood except to say it was stolen from him. But I never understood the full scope of what he endured. To be branded at 8 years old, to be displayed in a photograph showing that brand, to witness other children disappear or die, and then to survive and build a life anyway. That's extraordinary courage." James shows her Daniel's testimony, the full account of his years under Thornton's control. He shows her the records of other apprenticed children, the social worker's complaint that was dismissed, the evidence that Thornton branded dozens of children over more than a decade. "Thornton used the law to re-enslave children after emancipation," Sarah explains. "He branded them to mark his ownership, worked them without wages, and displayed them in photographs to document his control. And he faced no consequences because the system protected him." Patricia nods slowly. "My family needs to know this full story. Daniel never told his children everything. The shame and trauma were too deep, but his descendants need to understand what he survived and how he found the strength to build a life after that horror." James then raises the question he's been planning. "Reverend Johnson, I'd like to create an exhibition about Daniel's story and the apprenticeship system that re-enslaved black children after emancipation. It's a part of history that's not widely known or understood. Would you be comfortable with that?" Patricia looks at him with fierce determination. "Not just comfortable. I insist on it." Daniel testified before Congress about what was done to him, but nothing changed. Judge Thornton died, respected and unpunished. The truth was told, but not heard. Now, 140 years later, maybe people are ready to hear it. Maybe seeing that photograph, understanding what that hand gesture was displaying, will make people recognize that slavery didn't end in 1865. It just took different forms. Over the next months, James, Sarah, and Patricia work together to create the exhibition. They research other children apprenticed to Thornton and find records of at least 35 boys who passed through his control between 1868 and 1882. Many have no records after their apprenticeships ended. They simply vanish from the historical record, their fates unknown. For Samuel, who died at 12 falling from Thornton's roof, they find no family, no burial record beyond a notation in a church cemetery ledger. He exists in history only as a name, an age, and a cause of death that was almost certainly not the accident it was claimed to be. 8 months after James first opened that package, the Library of Congress opens the exhibition, The Secret in Their Hands, Child Apprenticeship, and the Re-Enslavement of Black Children After Emancipation. The exhibition occupies a major gallery, and lines form before the doors open on the first day. The centerpiece is the 1873 photograph. displayed with dramatic lighting that draws attention to the hand gesture all three figures are making. A magnified detail view shows what the gesture was designed to display. The triangular brand burned into the children's palms. Beside the photograph is Daniel Johnson's congressional testimony, the full account of being branded at 8 years old and forced to work for Judge Thornton for 8 years. The testimony is powerful and immediate, making the horror real in a way statistics cannot. The exhibition tells the complete story through documents, letters, and testimony. It explains how the apprenticeship system functioned as a means of re-enslaving black children, how judges like Thornton used their power to claim children were orphans, how families were powerless to reclaim their children once they were apprenticed. One section focuses on the practice of branding, explaining how Thornton marked children to identify them as his property and to make escape impossible. Historical documents describe the branding, but Daniel's testimony makes it visceral and personal. Another section examines what happened to apprenticed children after they were released at 15 or 18, how they had no education, no family connections, no resources, how the years of forced labor left them with trauma and scars, but few opportunities for building stable lives. A video plays continuously, featuring Reverend Patricia Johnson and other descendants of people who survived the apprenticeship system, sharing family stories about resilience and survival, explaining how the legacy of this system affected generations. The exhibition also displays a casting of an adult hand, showing what the triangular brand scar would have looked like. Daniel Johnson's hand, cast in 1920 when he was 57 years old, still showing the mark Thornton had burned into his flesh 52 years earlier. The scar had never faded, never let him forget. On opening day, James stands in the gallery, watching visitors engage with the exhibition. He sees people study the photograph, understanding gradually what that hand gesture meant, seeing the documentation of ownership hidden in plain sight for 151 years. Reverend Patricia Johnson stands beside him, staring at her great-great-grandfather's image. Daniel was 10 years old in this photograph, she says quietly. Already branded, already forced to work for 2 years, already knowing that other children disappeared or died. But he survived 8 years of this, and then he built a life. He married, had children, worked as a carpenter, and eventually found the courage to testify before Congress about what had been done to him. That testimony didn't bring justice, but it preserved the truth. And now, finally, people are hearing it. A young black boy approaches them, perhaps 10 years old, the same age Daniel was in the photograph. "Those boys had to work all day every day," he asks, pointing at the image. "And they got burned with that mark." "Yes," Patricia tells him gently. "They were forced to work without pay, and they were branded so everyone would know they belonged to Judge Thornton. It was wrong, and it was legal. That's why we have to remember, so we never allow such things to happen again." The boy stares at the photograph for a long moment. "They were brave," he says finally. "Yes," Patricia agrees. "They were extraordinarily brave." Throughout the day, visitors engage deeply with the exhibition, reading every document, watching the videos multiple times, sitting with the horror of what they're learning. The photograph that seemed to show a judge with 2 apprentices reveals itself to be something far darker. Documentation of ownership, proof of branding, evidence of a system that re-enslaved children in the name of charity and education. As the museum prepares to close that evening, James walks through the gallery one more time. He stops in front of the photograph, looking at the three figures with their hands clasped in that distinctive gesture. He thinks about Judge Nathaniel Thornton, who used his power to claim children, who branded them like livestock, who displayed them in photographs showing his mark burned into their flesh. Thornton died in 1885, respected and unpunished, his crimes protected by law and custom. He thinks about Samuel, who died at 12 in what was almost certainly not an accident, who has no grave marker, who exists in history only through this photograph and a brief death certificate. And he thinks about Daniel Johnson, who survived, who carried that triangular scar for 70 years, who testified about what was done to him even when no justice resulted, who made sure the truth was recorded for future generations. The photograph had waited 151 years to reveal its secret. The hand gesture that seemed like a formal pose was actually designed to display brands burned into children's palms. The portrait that appeared to document a respected judge with his apprentices was actually proof of ownership, evidence of a crime committed legally under a system designed to re-enslave black children after emancipation officially ended slavery. Now, the photograph has fulfilled a purpose Daniel Johnson likely hoped for when he testified in 1885. The truth has been revealed. The horror hidden in their hands has been exposed. And the courage of children who survived such systematic cruelty has been documented and honored. As visitors file past the image one last time, seeing it clearly for what it really shows, not mentorship but ownership, not opportunity but bondage, not the dignity of apprenticeship but the horror of re-enslavement, James thinks about all the other photographs waiting to be examined, all the other secrets hidden in formal poses, all the other truths that victims preserved through whatever means they could, hoping someday someone would look closely enough to see. The secret hidden in their hands has changed everything, revealing that slavery didn't end with the 13th Amendment, that black children continued to be claimed as property through legal systems designed to circumvent emancipation, that brands burned into flesh were documented in family portraits as casual displays of ownership. Daniel Johnson's testimony, preserved for 140 years, has finally been heard, and James is grateful to have played a part in ensuring that Daniel's courage, his survival, and his refusal to let the truth be forgotten are remembered and honored across the generations.